I never expected to inherit anything from my great-uncle Harold. We barely spoke during family gatherings, and he seemed like a gruff old man who preferred the company of his chickens to people. So when the lawyer called to inform me that Harold had left me his farm, I was stunned. The property sat on 50 acres of what used to be prime farmland, though it had been neglected for years. The house needed work, the barn was falling apart, and scattered around the yard were pieces of old farm equipment that looked like they hadn't run since the Carter administration. I drove out there on a Saturday morning, keys jangling in my pocket, unsure what I was going to do with the place. The real estate market was decent, and I figured I could probably sell it and use the money to pay off some student loans. But as I walked around the property, something about the place spoke to me. Maybe it was the way the morning light filtered through the oak trees, or the peaceful quiet that you can only find in the country. Whatever it was, I found myself seriously considering keeping the place. That's when Harold's neighbor, Jim Peterson, came walking over from the adjacent property. He was a lean man in his 60s, with hands that looked like they'd worked every day of his life. "You must be Harold's great-nephew," he said, extending a weathered hand. "Jim Peterson? I've been farming the land next door for 30 years. We shook hands and made small talk about Harold and the property. Jim seemed like a decent guy, and I got the impression he was sizing me up, trying to figure out what kind of person I was and what I planned to do with Harold's farm. After showing me around and pointing out various landmarks and property lines, Jim's demeanor shifted slightly. He got that look that people get when they're about to make a business proposition. "Listen," he said, kicking at a clump of dirt. "I've been thinking about expanding my operation for a while now. Your uncle's land would be perfect for what I have in mind. I'd be willing to make you a fair offer for the whole property." I told him I appreciated the offer but needed time to think about it. I was still processing the fact that I owned 50 acres of land, let alone deciding what to do with it. "Of course, take your time," Jim said. "But let me throw in something extra to sweeten the deal. See that old tractor over there?" He pointed to a rust-covered John Deere that looked like it hadn't moved in decades. "That thing's been sitting there for at least 10 years. Engines seized, tires are rotted, transmissions shot. It's basically scrap metal at this point." I looked over at the tractor. It was indeed a sorry sight, with weeds growing up around the wheels and rust eating away at every metal surface. "Take the tractor, it's worthless," Jim continued with a laugh. "I'll have it hauled off your property for free as part of the deal. Save you the trouble and expense of getting rid of it yourself. What do you say?" There was something about the way he said it that struck me as odd. Maybe it was too enthusiastic, or maybe he was trying a little too hard to convince me that the tractor was worthless. Either way, it planted a seed of curiosity in my mind. I told Jim I'd consider his offer and get back to him in a few days. That afternoon, I found myself walking back over to the old tractor. Up close, it was even more deteriorated than it had appeared from a distance. The paint had faded and peeled away, leaving patches of bare metal that had rusted orange and brown. The seat was cracked and splitting, with stuffing poking out like cotton from an old pillow. But as I walked around it, I noticed something interesting. Despite its obviously poor condition, this wasn't some cheap piece of equipment. This was a John Deere 4020, and even in this condition, I knew that model had been considered the gold standard of tractors back in its day. I tried to open the hood to look at the engine, but the latch was rusted shut. The doors to the cab were similarly stuck. Everything about this machine screamed abandonment and neglect. Still, something nagged at me about Jim's eagerness to haul it away. Maybe it was just my naturally suspicious nature, or maybe it was the fact that he'd brought up the tractor without me even asking about it. But I decided I wanted to know more about what I was potentially giving away. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the rest of the property. The barn was in rough shape, but structurally sound. The house had good bones despite needing cosmetic work, and scattered around the yard were tools and equipment that, while old, might still have some value. As the sun started to set, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sell to Jim just yet. at least not until I understood exactly what I was inheriting. And that included getting a better look at that supposedly worthless tractor. I made a mental note to come back the next weekend with some tools and see what secrets the old John Deere might be hiding. The following Saturday, I returned to the farm armed with a toolbox, some WD-40, and a determination to get inside that tractor. I'd spent the week reading about John Deere 40-20s online, and I'd learned they were indeed valuable machines, even as scrap metal. The hood latch finally gave way after liberal applications of penetrating oil and some gentle persuasion with a hammer. When I lifted the hood, I was surprised by what I found. Yes, the engine was obviously seized and covered in rust, but everything was still there. In many cases, parts alone from these old tractors could be worth hundreds of dollars. The cab door took more effort, but eventually, I managed to pry it open. The interior was a mess of torn upholstery and rusted metal, but again, I could see that the bones of a quality machine were still there. I was poking around the various controls and gauges when I decided to check the fuel tank. It was located under the seat, and accessing it required removing several rusted bolts. The work was slow going, but I was getting curious about Jim's insistence that the tractor was completely worthless. When I finally got the access panel off and peered into the fuel tank, I expected to find either empty space or old, gummed-up gasoline. What I found instead made me sit back on my heels and stare. The tank wasn't empty, and it wasn't full of old gas either. Instead, there was something wrapped in what looked like oilcloth or waterproof material. Something that definitely wasn't supposed to be in a fuel tank. My heart started beating faster as I realized I might have stumbled onto something significant. But getting whatever it was out of the tank was going to require more work and better tools than I had with me that day. I spent the entire week thinking about what I'd found in that fuel tank. Part of me wanted to rush back immediately and extract whatever was hidden there, but the rational part of my brain told me to be patient and do this right. I researched the best ways to safely drain and clean old fuel tanks, invested in some proper tools, and even bought a small pump designed for removing liquids from tight spaces. I also made sure to bring gloves, safety glasses, and a mask. Whatever was in there had been sitting for years, possibly decades, and I didn't want to take any chances with my health. When Saturday finally arrived, I was ready. I started by carefully pumping out what little liquid remained in the tank. It came out as a thick, dark sludge that smelled terrible and had probably been sitting there since the Reagan administration. With the tank mostly empty, I could get a better look at the mysterious package. It was definitely wrapped in some kind of waterproof material, and it was larger than I'd initially thought. Maybe the size of a shoebox, but flatter. Getting it out of the tank required removing the fuel sending unit entirely, which meant more rusty bolts and more creative use of penetrating oil. But eventually, I had access to the entire tank through the sending unit opening. I carefully maneuvered the package out, trying not to damage whatever was inside. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and the wrapping felt like it might be oiled canvas, or maybe heavy-duty plastic from an earlier era. My hands were shaking slightly as I carried the package over to a clean workbench I'd set up in the barn. This felt like one of those moments that could change everything, though I had no idea in which direction. I carefully untied the cord that held the wrapping closed and peeled back the layers of protective material. What I found inside took my breath away. Inside the waterproof wrapping were stacks of bills. Not just any bills, but crisp, clean currency that looked like it had been stored in a bank vault. Most of it was in hundreds, but there were also 50s and 20s, all bound with rubber bands that had somehow survived decades of storage. I sat there staring at the money, trying to process what I was seeing. There had to be thousands of dollars here, maybe tens of thousands. But that wasn't even the most interesting part. Mixed in with the more common bills were notes that I didn't immediately recognize. They looked older, with different designs, and what appeared to be higher denominations. Some were clearly from decades past, and others looked like they might be even older than that. I carefully separated the money into different piles, trying to get a sense of what I was dealing with. The newer bills alone were substantial, but it was the older currency that really caught my attention. I wasn't an expert on collectible money, but I knew enough to recognize that some of these bills might be worth considerably more than their face value. There were also some papers tucked in with the money. They appeared to be documents of some kind, though they were written in Harold's spidery handwriting and would require careful study to decipher. As I sat in that old barn, surrounded by stacks of money that had been hidden for who knows how long, I began to understand why Jim Peterson had been so eager to haul away that worthless tractor. Somehow, he must have known about this cash, or at least suspected it existed. The question was, what did he know? And how did he know it? I carefully rewrapped everything and locked it in the truck before heading home. I had a lot of research to do, and I needed to figure out exactly what Harold had left me. I spent the next several days researching the currency I'd found, and the results were staggering. Several of the older bills were indeed collectible, with some worth many times their face value. A few appeared to be quite rare, potentially worth thousands of dollars each to the right collector. But the real revelation came when I started researching Harold's background more thoroughly. I'd always known he was a private man, but I discovered that his privacy might have had deeper reasons than simple introversion. Through online genealogy sites and old newspaper archives, I found references to Harold being involved in some kind of business dispute in the 1970s. The details were sketchy, but it appeared to involve a construction company and allegations of missing funds. Nothing was ever proven, and no charges were filed, but the controversy seemed to have followed Harold for years. I also found records showing that Harold had been quite successful in his younger days. He'd owned several businesses and had accumulated significant wealth before retiring to the farm. But there were gaps in the timeline, periods where his financial activities weren't clearly documented. The documents I'd found with the money were starting to make more sense as I deciphered Harold's handwriting. They appeared to be records of various transactions and investments, along with what looked like instructions for accessing other hidden assets. One document in particular caught my attention. It was a hand-drawn map of the property, with several locations marked with small X's. If I was reading it correctly, the tractor was just one of several hiding places Harold had used over the years. I was beginning to realize that my inheritance might be worth considerably more than I'd initially thought. But I was also starting to understand why Jim Peterson had been so interested in acquiring the property, and why he'd been so eager to dispose of that worthless tractor. Armed with my new knowledge, I decided it was time to have another conversation with Jim Peterson. But this time, I planned to be the one asking the questions. I found him working in his field on Tuesday afternoon and walked over to chat. He seemed pleased to see me and immediately asked if I'd given any more thought to his offer for the property. "Actually, I have," I said. "But I'm curious about something. You seem pretty eager to haul away that old tractor for me. That's quite generous, considering the cost of moving something that heavy." Jim's expression didn't change, but I noticed his hands pause in their work. "Just being neighborly," he said. "That thing's an eyesore, and I've got the equipment to move it." "I've been doing some research on those old John Deeres," I continued. "Even in rough condition, they've got some valuable parts. Seems like there might be some money in that old tractor after all." This time, Jim's reaction was more noticeable. He straightened up and looked directly at me, and I could see him trying to gauge how much I knew. "Well, I suppose you could part it out," he said carefully, "though it would be a lot of work for not much return. The engine's completely seized, transmission's shut, hydraulics are ruined. You'd be lucky to get a few $100s for the whole thing." I nodded as if I agreed with him, but I was watching his body language. Everything about his response suggested he was working hard to downplay the tractor's value. "You know, I'm thinking I might hold on to the property for a while," I said. "Maybe try my hand at farming. Always wanted to live in the country." Jim forced a smile, but I could see he wasn't pleased with this development. "Well, if you change your mind about selling, my offer stands," he said. "But I should mention that farming's not as easy as it looks. A lot of hard work, and the margins are pretty thin these days." As I walked back to my truck, I was more convinced than ever that Jim knew something about Harold's hidden assets. The question was, how much did he know, and what was he planning to do about it? That weekend, I returned to the farm with a metal detector I'd borrowed from a friend. Harold's map had marked several locations around the property, and I wanted to see if there were more surprises waiting to be discovered. The first few locations turned out to be false alarms. The metal detector picked up plenty of signals, but they turned out to be old farm equipment, buried fence posts, and the usual collection of metal debris that accumulates on any working farm over the decades. But the fourth location, marked near the old well behind the barn, produced something more interesting. About 2 feet down, I found a metal box wrapped in the same type of waterproof material I'd discovered in the tractor. This box was smaller than the package from the fuel tank, but it was heavier. When I opened it, I found more currency, along with some jewelry and what appeared to be stock certificates and other financial documents. The jewelry alone looked valuable, including several pieces that appeared to be antique. But it was the stock certificates that really caught my attention. They were from companies I'd never heard of, dating back to the 1960s and 1970s. Some might be worthless, but others could potentially be quite valuable if the companies had been acquired or had changed names over the years. I was starting to realize that Harold had been systematically hiding assets around his property for decades. But why? Was he avoiding taxes? Hiding money from creditors? Or was there something more sinister going on? As I worked my way through the remaining locations on the map, I found 2 more caches. One contained more cash and some gold coins, while the other held documents that appeared to be deeds and property records for land I didn't even know Harold had owned. By the end of the day, I estimated I'd found assets worth at least $100,000, possibly much more. And according to Harold's map, there were still 3 more locations to check. I was no longer just the heir to a run-down farm. I was potentially sitting on a fortune that Harold had spent years carefully hiding and protecting. Monday morning, I got a call at work from my neighbor back in the city. Someone had been asking questions about me, specifically about whether I'd inherited any property recently and whether I'd been spending time on a farm outside of town. The person asking had claimed to be from an insurance company, but something about the conversation had made my neighbor suspicious. Insurance companies don't usually go door to door asking about people's inheritances. That afternoon, I drove out to the farm to check on things, and I immediately noticed that something was different. The old tractor had been moved slightly, just a few inches, but enough that I could tell someone had been there. I checked the fuel tank where I'd found the first cache, and sure enough, there were fresh tool marks around the access panel. Someone had been looking for exactly what I'd already found. I walked around the rest of the property, and I could see subtle signs that someone had been searching. Dirt had been disturbed in a few places, and some of the other locations marked on Harold's map showed signs of recent digging. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind this. Jim Peterson had access to the property as a neighbor, and he clearly knew more about Harold's hidden assets than he'd been letting on. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I could confront him directly, but that might escalate the situation in unpredictable ways. I could call the police, but I wasn't sure they'd take trespassing complaints seriously, especially when no obvious damage had been done. Or I could try to stay one step ahead of him and secure the remaining assets before he found them. I decided on the latter approach. That night, I returned to the farm with better tools and a plan to excavate the remaining locations on Harold's map. If Jim wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I got to the prizes first. Working by flashlight and moving as quietly as possible, I spent most of that night digging up Harold's remaining caches. It was exhausting work, but I was motivated by the knowledge that I was likely racing against Jim Peterson to claim what was rightfully mine. The 5th location yielded another box of cash and jewelry, along with what appeared to be a safety deposit box key and some bank documents. The 6th location was empty, but the dirt showed signs of recent disturbance. Jim had apparently beaten me to that one. The 7th and final location on the map was the most challenging. It was marked near the old chicken coop, and the ground there was hard-packed clay that had been baked solid by years of sun. But my persistence paid off.
3 feet down, I found Harold's largest cache yet. This one was contained in a waterproof military surplus container, the kind used to transport ammunition. Inside were stacks of currency, gold coins, more jewelry, and a thick folder of documents. But the most interesting item was a leather-bound journal filled with Harold's handwriting.
As I flipped through it by flashlight, I realized it was essentially a detailed record of Harold's hidden assets and the reasons he'd gone to such lengths to conceal them. According to the journal, Harold had indeed been involved in some questionable financial dealings in his younger days. Nothing illegal, he claimed, but ethically gray enough that he'd attracted the attention of both the IRS and some unsavory business associates. Rather than risk having his assets seized or stolen, Harold had gradually moved his wealth into cash and portable valuables, which he'd then hidden around his property. The journal contained detailed maps and inventories of everything he'd buried, along with instructions for accessing bank accounts and safety deposit boxes that apparently still contained additional assets. But the most shocking revelation was in the final pages of the journal.
Harold had discovered that Jim Peterson knew about at least some of the hidden caches, and he suspected Jim had been slowly stealing from them over the years. According to Harold's notes, Jim had once worked for one of Harold's construction companies and had access to financial records that might have revealed the existence of the hidden assets. Harold had fired Jim after discovering discrepancies in the books, but apparently the damage had already been done. The next morning, I was ready for a confrontation with Jim Peterson. I'd spent the night securing all of Harold's assets that I could find, and I'd photographed every page of the journal as evidence of Jim's alleged theft. But Jim found me first. I was loading the last of the containers into my truck when he came walking across the field from his property. He didn't look like the friendly neighbor I'd met a few weeks earlier. This time his expression was hard and determined. "You've been busy," he said, nodding toward the truck. "Just cleaning up some old junk Harold left lying around," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. Jim laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Cut the crap. We both know what you found in that tractor, and we both know there's more scattered around this property." I decided there was no point in pretending anymore. "You're right. Harold left quite a collection. Too bad it all belongs to me now." "Actually, that's where you're wrong," Jim said. "Some of that money was mine to begin with. Harold owed me wages from when I worked for him, and he never paid what he promised. According to Harold's journal, he fired you for stealing." Jim's face darkened. Harold was paranoid and vindictive. He accused me of taking money that he'd probably just misplaced or spent and forgotten about. "So you decided to take it from his property after he died." "I decided to collect what was rightfully mine," Jim said. "And I'm not done collecting." He took a step closer to me, and I realized this situation was potentially dangerous. Jim was bigger than me, and we were alone on an isolated property with no witnesses around. "Here's what's going to happen," Jim continued. "You're going to share what you found, 50-50. Otherwise, I'm going to make your life very complicated. I know every inch of this property, and I know where Harold hid things that aren't on any map you might have found." I looked at Jim Peterson and realized I was dealing with someone who was desperate enough to make threats and possibly follow through on them. But I also knew something he didn't know I knew, and that gave me some leverage of my own. "Before I agree to anything," I said, "I'm curious about something. How did you know about the safety deposit box Harold rented in town under a false name?" Jim's confident expression wavered slightly. "What safety deposit box?" "The one mentioned in his journal. The one you cleaned out 2 weeks after Harold's funeral, using forged documents." This was actually a bluff on my part. I'd found references to safety deposit boxes in Harold's documents, but I didn't know for certain that Jim had accessed them. But Jim's reaction told me I'd hit close to the mark. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The thing about committing crimes is that they leave paper trails," I continued. "Bank security cameras, signature cards, witness statements. If you've been accessing Harold's accounts illegally, that's federal fraud." Jim was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "You can't prove anything." "Maybe not yet, but I bet if the right people started asking the right questions, they'd find some interesting answers." I pulled out my phone and made a show of starting to dial a number. "I think it's time to involve the authorities. Let them sort out what's legal and what isn't." "Wait," Jim said quickly.
Let's not be hasty. Maybe we can work something out. I paused with my finger over the phone. I'm listening. Look, maybe I did access some of Harold's accounts after he died, but only because I knew he owed me money and his estate wasn't going to pay his debts. I was just collecting what was rightfully mine. By committing fraud. Jim sighed and seemed to deflate slightly. By making sure I didn't get completely screwed over by a dead man's paranoia. I could see that Jim's bravado was mostly gone, replaced by the realization that he was in a much more precarious legal position than I was. In the end, Jim and I reached an agreement that avoided involving law enforcement, but still protected my interests. He would return whatever he had taken from Harold's accounts and safety deposit boxes, and in exchange, I wouldn't press charges for the fraud and theft. It turned out that Jim had indeed been systematically looting Harold's hidden assets for years, both before and after Harold's death. The amount he'd taken was substantial, but not as much as what I'd managed to recover. When everything was tallied up, Harold's hidden fortune was worth nearly $500,000 in cash, precious metals, jewelry, and collectible currency. The various bank accounts and safety deposit boxes yielded additional assets worth almost as much again. But perhaps the most valuable discovery was Harold's collection of real estate investments that he'd made under various names over the decades. Properties that had been purchased for thousands were now worth hundreds of thousands, and the rental income from them had been quietly accumulating in accounts that Harold had set up but never touched. Jim Peterson ended up selling his farm and moving away from the area. I heard through the local grapevine that he'd gotten into some financial trouble and needed to liquidate his assets quickly. As for me, I kept Harold's farm and used some of his hidden fortune to restore it to working condition. I had that old John Deere tractor completely rebuilt, and it now runs like new. Every time I drive it, I think about the fortune that was hidden in its fuel tank and the lessons I learned about assuming something is worthless just because it looks that way on the surface. The farm has become a profitable operation, and I've discovered that I actually enjoy the rural lifestyle.
Harold's legacy gave me not just financial security, but a completely new way of life that I never would have imagined for. Sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as burdens, and sometimes what appears to be junk turns out to be treasure. Harold knew that, and in his own secretive way, he made sure I learned it too. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible story of hidden treasures and unexpected discoveries.
I hope you enjoyed following along as we uncovered Harold's secrets and learned that sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in the most unlikely places. I'd love to hear from you. Please write in the comments below and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. Are you in a bustling city, a quiet rural town, or somewhere in between? Your stories and perspectives from around the globe always make these storytelling sessions even more special. And if you enjoyed this tale of mystery and discovery, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We have many more incredible stories coming your way, each one filled with unexpected twists and fascinating revelations. Until next time, keep your eyes open for the extraordinary hiding in the ordinary. You never know what treasures might be waiting to be discovered in your own backyard.